So this is my third presentation this week here. And all of the presentations really are based on the research which I've just published recently, most of the aspects of the research in this book. And I brought one copy to leave here, and I thought maybe Christian would be a good person to hold on to it and show it around to people, because he's come to a number of these presentations. So I came to a NAIL data session several years ago here, and so I was really happy to be invited back, because I think there aren't a lot of groups who do this kind of data sessions of conversation analysis, which I feel is really the heart of the research that I do. So in my first talk here, I talked about the technology of the virtual math teams in collaboration environment. And I made claims about how it was designed to support collaboration and help small groups of students to do collaborative learning. And the second talk I gave yesterday was, let's see, did anybody go? Design. No, design was the first one. Curriculum, that's it, right. It was a curriculum, and that we had designed this curriculum to introduce geometry to students who may not have had it before, and also to teachers of mathematics, to give them a more hands-on feel of geometry, in particular dynamic geometry, as implemented in the GeoGebra system. And I claim that our curriculum provided a good introduction to a certain way of thinking about mathematics, especially focused on hands-on construction and the concept of dependencies. And I really want students to think about dependencies in geometry. And so then the question is always, does the technology work to do what it was designed to do? And does the curriculum work to promote collaborative learning? And to me, the way to answer that is to look at the logs of students working and to try to see what's going on there, and if there is evidence there that they have done the things that we designed the system and the curriculum to do. And so today's presentation is, in a sense, the culmination or the proof of whether we've accomplished something. And of course, this is a research project, so it's not over. So we don't have to claim that we've accomplished everything yet. And the method of the research is this design-based research approach, which is very iterative and includes analysis of student learning in every cycle of development of the system and of the curriculum. And so the kind of analysis that I want to present today is a core part of the research methodology. So I don't use quantitative methods and statistics to demonstrate learning. I use more conversation analysis as applied to an online system like this. So that's what I want to not only present today, but interact with all of you on. So what I'm going to do first is go through the first couple lessons that students had last spring and take a look at how they started out interacting, how they started out collaborating, how they started out talking about geometry. And then move to their last session, which was their eighth session. They had 8 sessions, each about an hour long. And try to look at that with you, because I haven't really analyzed that one myself very thoroughly at all. And see if we can see evidence of change in their interaction, in their collaboration, in their discourse about mathematics. and see if those changes have anything to do with what we designed the system to do. So I'd like today to be informal. We have, I think, a lot of time, as much time as we need probably. And so feel free to interrupt at any point and discuss something that you find interesting. Because I'm going to go fairly quickly through the first sessions in order then to focus really on doing some kind of a data session around the last session that they had. And so on this screen, I'm going to have some tools that we use for analysis. And this will be my PowerPoint slides. So the Virtual Math Teams project has been a research project that I've been directing for over 10 years at Drexel University. It's virtual because it's an online system. It's about math because it focuses on geometry now. And it includes teams because it's a collaborative learning system. And it looks pretty much like this. This is actually our replayer that replays sessions. And down here are our replayer controls. But from this line upwards is exactly what the students see. So what you see here is exactly what 3 students saw last March or February. And this is the chat over here, and this is the first chat that they used in the system when they first came in. There are three young girls whose login names are Cornflakes, Fruit Loops, and Cheerios, 3 American cereals. So for privacy reasons, they don't use their real names. And the first person is Cornflakes, and she says, "Hey," almost Swedish, huh? For hello. And Fruit Loops responds, "Hello." And then Cheerios comes in and says, "Hey." So that's how they began their first session in the VMT environment. And this is what they saw on the screen. So they just came in. That's what they saw. We don't know what they thought of it. We don't know, if they read it carefully or not, whatever. But they saw over here that they could chat, so they started chatting. They knew how to do that. So that's the beginning of the system. So these are 3 girls. They're in the 7th grade, so they're about 13, 14 years old. They're taking an algebra course, so they haven't had geometry yet. At least in the United States, the sequence is usually Algebra 1, then Geometry, and then Algebra 2. I don't know if you break up algebra with geometry in the middle or not, but that's how they do it. So they had about a week, a 1-week introduction to geometry the previous year, and that was pretty much it. So they're basically naive about geometry, and this is their first. The teacher had gone through our professional development course in which she had some experience with GeoGebra and with the VMT system. And then she organized her students in this algebra class into an after-school event where they met in these small groups online after school for 8 sessions, each about an hour long. And that's about all we know, actually, about the girls. I don't know, what they looked like or anything else about them. I don't know what kind of grades they got. In the book that I gave to Christian there's a chapter 7 which goes through some of the analysis of the logs that I'll go through this morning. And we'll see the kind of tools that we have with the VMT system over here for doing analysis. So like I said, I want to quickly go through especially topic 1 and then topics 5 and 6, which are kind of key to me for seeing how they're learning the geometry. And then consider their last topic, which was called topic 13, in more detail. So this was the first curriculum unit. And so the curriculum consists of some text that's shown online in this tab, and usually some geometric construction that they work on. So this is just a welcoming one, welcomes them to the VMT project, and then has 12 steps with this little note: when you're finished working together in one tab, move on to the next and try to finish all the tabs, which they never really finish them. But you see there's a possibility of having several tabs in the VMT system. So each one can have a little GeoGebra, and each of these tabs is the GeoGebra environment converted to multi-user. So everybody in the team sees the same thing, and they can all manipulate the same geometric objects. So it's a multi-user collaboration version of GeoGebra. So the steps here were: use the chat to decide who will do each step, and we can see how they do that. Someone click on the take control button. So there's this button here, take control. So only one person can manipulate the GeoGebra objects at a time. Everybody can read it and see what the other person's doing, but only one person can be active at a time. And the reason is to support collaboration, so that they don't go off, each student doing their own thing, but they all observe what everybody else is doing, and they keep the focus on the same thing, the same actions. Then click on the button for the point tool at the top. So these are the GeoGebra tools. Here you can see, if you're familiar with GeoGebra, that I've reduced the set of tools to only have a couple tools available to them for their first session. Now realize they've never seen GeoGebra before, so and they've never seen VMT before. Presumably they've been used to chatting, so they're familiar with how to do that and how to greet each other. But they have to be introduced here to the VMT system and to GeoGebra and to the mathematical topic of geometry, and probably to collaborative learning. They may not have had any collaborative learning experiences in school either. So it's a lot that we have to introduce them to through the curriculum, and we can see all of those things unfolding in the data. And then step 4 is create some points, release control and let someone else take control, use the move tool to move the points around, then create a line segment, and so on. Over here, drag the line segment around and explore the tools in the tool. And then finally, chat about what you notice. So there's a prompt to do collaborative discourse in using the chat. So here's a log. So we can produce a spreadsheet log of what happened. And the spreadsheet includes system comments. So Cornflakes is now viewing tab called objects, or called dragging. So you see in this series that one of the students, the one named Cornflakes, is looking through all the different tabs to get an overview. It also includes awareness feature that Fruit Loops here fully erased the chat message. So you can see here what time Fruit Loops started typing in the chat and when she finished, and that she was typing for seconds. But then instead of posting it for others to see, she erased it. So we can interpret that in some way, that she was starting to say something but then stopped. And so nobody saw what she was typing, but they did see, they saw down here a notice, Fruit Loops is typing. So they knew she was preparing something to say and that she didn't. And so that may play into the interaction. Also, we like to keep the start time and the post time so we know when she started typing. So if she started typing before somebody else posted something, then she's probably not responding to that posting. She's probably responding to something before. So it helps us interpret the threading of the chat. And then, of course, also the posts, things that do get posted are displayed. And although you don't see it here yet, because they haven't started using the GeoGebra tools, it'll show which tool they selected and what they did with it. So it's a quite complete log of the interaction, yeah.
Gerry, can I just ask, when cornflakes is flipping through the tabs, is that student then flipping through the tabs for everyone else? Like,
No.
do you use a lock at that level?
No.
No.
There are some things that are not shared. So zooming is not shared. So if one of the students comes in and drags the screen around or zooms in and out, that is not shared. And also changing tabs is not shared. But changing tabs gets posted here. So in the chat, it will say, Cornflakes is looking at that tab. So others know where everybody's looking, but they don't get distracted and pulled over there. So let's just start looking here and see how they're doing. So they say hello to each other. And then, these are three girls in the same class. They're probably in the same room in a computer lab. But one says, who's Fruit Loops? And the other one answers Daniela. So here's a privacy breach. So, but that's as far as it goes. From then on, they use their serial names. And you can see typical texting, spelling errors, like whose, and taking is misspelled, but then corrected in the next one. That's what the asterisk means. It's a convention from texting. So they introduce each other, or they say hello to each other, they greet each other. One of them looks through the different tabs. And then Cheerios asks, so who's doing what? Who wants to take, Fruit Loop says, who wants to take control? Cheerios says, Daniela, do you want to? So they do use the real name there.
Do you often see these kind of like reformulations? Who's taking control, or which becomes Daniela, do you want to take control? Because they are picking up those instructions, reformulating them as questions. Is that the common way of doing collaboration, or at least deciding who's doing what?
The chat is the common way of, yeah.
Yeah, but like picking up those instructions and
Yes.
reformulating them as questions, and also being more specific as you go. Because what happens there is that the first two no one picks it up. But by providing a candid there, it's just, it projects, it's easier to come to a decision that way. Have you looked at that, like the different ways of reformulating the instructions into these common decisions?
Not systematically, no. But we're just starting to look at the data. This is from last spring. And that's what we're doing now, today. So it's good for you to point that out.
Because it has this, even on this page, it seems like it has the same structure, and there might be a kind of structure that connects it very much to how certain kind of decisions are made in these types of environments. There might be a logic to it.
Yeah. And there's also a progression to it. So I think we can see how they're doing it now in their first meeting, and then later we'll look at it, how they do it when they come into their last session. They do it, I think, spoiler alert, they do it much more efficiently later. So it takes a while for them to get started, and that's really my point here. In the first session, it's taking them all this time, and you know, if you followed the time sequence, there might be big pauses between things happening, and so on. And so here, you know, they're starting to type things and erasing them, and then they ask, "Do you want to take control?" "No, you take control." "Who wants to do it?" No one wants to do it, even in capital letters. "No, I don't want to do it. I don't want to take control." "Why not?" And giving an argument, why not, and so on. So no one's actually done anything yet. They're all just arguing about what should we do and who's going to do it. Whereas you'll see in the last session they come in and the first one says, "I'm doing this," and then the other one says, "Now I want to do it." So it's very different. So they've learned to, they go through all this in order to figure out how to behave, and then in future sessions they'll know how to behave and efficiently or effectively. Yeah.
In line 35, Cheerios says, or types, it says no one has control. Is that according to the system?
Yeah, down here, nobody has control. That's probably what she's referring to. So if Cornflakes presses the control button, then it will say, everybody else will read down here, Cornflakes has control. When Cornflakes is control, it will say, you have control. But when no one's pressed that button, then it says no one has control. Yeah, so you can see that they're noticing things about the system and expressing that in the chat. Okay, so in the replayer, you can see the timing. So you can play this like a movie or VCR, and you can pick a speed. So you can play it at the original speed or 10 times the speed. And you just press the go button and well, let me speed it up a little. So in this way you get a sense of the time where there's long pauses in the chat and where things move along more quickly. And if you play it at the regular speed of 1, you're basically viewing exactly what a typical student in the group saw. So you're re-experiencing it in a way. Of course, you're not a 14-year-old girl in this course, so you experience it differently. You're a researcher observing it. But the view is pretty much exactly what they say. In fact, the technology that runs the reviewer is the same technology using the same data as runs the screen for the students when they're interacting in it. So it's a quite complete and accurate view of what took place. So here you see them. So Cheerio says, I think we have to follow the numbered list. So again, they're looking back and making reference to this numbered list. And they'll talk about what step they're on. So here, I'm not sure, number 3, I guess, or what should I do? Number 3? No, I already did 3, do 5, and so on. So they're starting to reference and coordinate about where they are as a group on the list of instructions. So they're learning about the system, they're learning about what they should do, how to do it, how to coordinate it. All these things have to be learned from scratch because this is their first time doing anything like this, probably. So actually, they're quite efficient. They're quite good at it. They're technology aware, and they figure out what to do and how to coordinate it. There's sometimes they're not sure what to do and they try something. They're very explorative, and you'll see that especially when they start using GeoGebra. They're extremely explorative. They're not worried about breaking the technology or whatever. So they try things, and they're not really that discouraged if it doesn't work. They go on and try something else, or somebody else tries it. And they express, like, I'm so lost. That's a really typical statement in this system. In the beginning, people just feel lost. What should I do? Where am I? What's going on? What am I supposed to be doing? What's everyone else doing? They just feel lost about it. There's a lot, there's a lot of expectations. Whoever wrote this had a lot of expectations about what they wanted the students to do, and the students, kind of feel that, but they're not sure exactly how to respond to that. And so, like here, Cheerio says it says to release control. So they're looking not only that there's a numbered list that they have to go through, not only do they have to coordinate so the whole group is at the same point, but they have to start reading carefully the different instructions and interpreting what does it mean by release control. Oh, that means hitting a certain button in the interface. So here, it just continues on and on. Now they're at step 6, release control. It's released. Who's going to take control? They're still debating who's going to take control, what each person did, and sharing it so that everybody knows where everybody is in the process, negotiating, making agreements. What to do next, planning. All the steps of collaboration have to get worked out. How do we do collaboration in this environment? And what's it mean to collaborate? And we can see it here. We can see how these different aspects of collaboration unfold in a group who's never done it before. And then we can see in later sessions, or it's less visible maybe in later sessions because they've worked it all out and they're efficient at it and they don't have to chat that much about it. But here we can see it actually taking place and the birth of collaboration. See, by here now, Fruit Loops asks to go next. She doesn't yet say, I'm going next. She doesn't just go next, but she asks, can I go next? Yeah, go ahead. So, and they both of the other ones say yes, and they agree to it. So it's worked out there. So here, Cheerios isn't sure what's going on. What about 8? So here they're talking about 6 and 7, And then it jumps to 9 and 10. Well, what happened to 8? She wants to know. And first she types something, we don't know what it is, but she's not happy with that. And afterwards she types something she's not happy with. But there's some question about what's going on in her, coming from Fruit Loops, not coming from Cheerios. And it doesn't really get answered explicitly either. But they go ahead with their work. And then here you see they're starting to talk about the geometry. The triangle got bigger, connecting to points. And here so now they're on point 11. So let's see what point 11 was. Explore the tools in the toolbar and chat about what you notice. So they've done now, at this point they've done some GeoGebra work and they're starting to chat about what they've accomplished. So it doesn't show up in the chat log here. I guess I've filtered out the GeoGebra actions from the log here. So I can go back and unfilter them. Over here. And now we have GeoGebra actions showing up in the spreadsheet. So cornflakes changed to the GeoGebra move tool, updated, did something with point E, did something with point H, and so on. So that gives us some idea in detail about who's doing what. In the GeoGebra. So here's Cheerios doing things, and here's cornflakes doing things, and then Fruit Loops. But it doesn't give you a really good feel for what's going on in the GeoGebra. So it's better to look at the replayer. And let's just slide over here. So they've been asked, if we go back to the beginning, they were asked to make a point or a couple points, make a line segment, move it around, there's another line segment, bunch of line segments. So they make a number of 5 points and a bunch of segments connecting them. So that's their GeoGebra work in response to the idea of exploring the basic tools, the most basic tools of GeoGebra. And then they're asked to chat about it. So here if we played it, so we could go back to back to when they started doing the GeoGebra and watching it at 6 times the normal speed. We can follow the process that they went through doing their geometry construction. And then we can look at the spreadsheet and see who's doing what and so on.
Is it possible to see the chart as it?
Yeah, yeah. It just wasn't scrolling here. There it is. So they're chatting about it and then moving things around. Yeah, so in the replayer, the chat is synchronized with the GeoGebra actions. And then these little squares here represent actions in GeoGebra. And they're color coordinated, so the red goes with cornflakes, and if Cheerios does things, they should be blue squares. So it looks like
Is it time or clicks or?
clicks, actions, yeah. Yeah, here's 2 different colors, so 2 different, and there's Cheerios is doing something there. Well, that's not really showing up on the screen.
They're working in different tabs.
Oh, right, they've moved on to, you're right. They're probably in this tab now, moving things around. But anyway, we wanted to stay in the first tab and see what they think of what they're doing. So here, chat about what we noticed. So now they're at the last point, which is a prompt to talk about, to reflect on the geometry that they've created. So it said, chat about what you notice. That was the prompt. And so here, Cornflakes repeats the question, chat about what we notice, question mark. So like you say, they've converted it into a question about what they should do. And so Cheerios' reflection is, it's a very interesting shape. So when I wrote the instruction, I wanted them to chat about dynamic geometry elements. That, we can drag things in different ways, and maybe some points we can't drag, and if I drag this point here, then the lines that come from it move and so on. But instead, Cheerios' comment is, it's an interesting shape. And then says, and Fruit Loops starts to say something but decides against it. Cheerios says, a rectangle and a triangle that's mushed together. Okay, so that actually is probably a typical kind of observation of a child looking at geometry. Children think about not geometric relationships, but appearances. So it looks like a triangle and a rectangle. Every kid knows a kind of stereotype appearance of a triangle and of a rectangle. And here they're mushed together on top of each other, sort of. So it's not the kind of thing that I would say about a GeoGebra construction, but it's probably a very typical thing for someone who hasn't studied geometry at that age to say about how they view it. It's like a polygon, so that's a little bit more sophisticated, right? So Cornflakes wants the others to respond, either agreeing or not. No curved edges, because it's made of a line segment, and line segment are lines, and lines that don't have curves. So this is talking about geometric aspects of it. It has 6 sides, now Cheerios, and obtuse and acute angles, no right angles, so they know something about the vocabulary of geometry. And Cornflakes agrees, yep, no right angles, and Fruit Loops wonders how I can make it smaller. Maybe it's scrolled off the screen partly, so she wants to bring it all on the screen maybe. And then they're ready to move on. Should we move on? Moving on means going to the next tab. So are they finished? Well, they've gone through all 12 points. They've discussed it. Now they're negotiating, are we finished discussing it? And what should we do next? Should we move on to the next tab? And so they agree. And here you can see each of them agrees to move on. So that's their complete experience with the first kind of curricular unit that they're exposed to. So I'm ready to move on. Are you? We should negotiate that. Do you want to say anything else about this? Yeah.
I find this very interesting on the part of, say, a researcher, because if you're trying to analyze the conversation, it's well documented, and there's no such overlapping in the same way as you analyze a video.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder as well how it would be when it is like Skype-like conversation to put in there, because I wonder whether it is more natural for kids to think aloud of their mathematical thinking, for example, rather than writing, because at times when you write, you tend not to write it because typing is cumbersome.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder whether how to address this, getting the maximum, documenting the thinking from the learners, using this and comparing it using the video, where they can, like a screencast that they can
Mm-hmm.
put in there. So there seems to be, I'm trying to figure out how it would be.
Yeah, I can't really say because we only have this way of doing it.
Yeah.
So in this environment, all of their communication is done textually through the chat, textually or in GeoGebra, by actions in GeoGebra. So all that I can say is that the only thing that the students know about what the others are thinking or whatever is what appears in the text. And we have all of that. So that if you're looking at, what I do is I look at the group, what's going on interactionally in the group. And the whole interaction within the group is text-based and GeoGebra action-based. So any question about other things going on is not really part of the group interaction. So they could be doing all kinds of things. If they were doing this at home, their parents might be there telling them what to do. or answering questions. They might be drawing on pieces of paper as well as in GeoGebra. But not only we don't know that, any of that, but the other students don't know it. So it's not entering into the group interaction. And as a researcher myself, I'm interested in the group interaction, not in whatever else the students might have said if they were in some other situation where they had different media and so on. And the communication media is very different, as you point out. Texting is very different from speaking. And it has different affordances. And one of the affordances here is that the students can see is persistence. So they can see what's been typed previously. And they can even scroll back in the chat and see things that have scrolled off the chat here. So that's the advantage of text. There are a lot of advantages of text we've learned over the centuries. There are a lot of disadvantages.
No overlapping.
There's a different kind of overlapping. So people can't talk at the same time like you and I are just doing. But they can be typing at the same time. So when you talk, you usually take turns. And I only talked over you to make a point, but normally I would have waited for you to finish. And in text, though, they can all be typing at the same time. So there is an overlap. If you look at the timestamps, one person may be starting while another person is still typing and so on. So there's that different kind of overlap. And in fact, that makes chat complicated because, especially with the larger group, there can be a lot of overlapping, and you have to figure out the threading of the response structure, both as a researcher and as a participant. You have to figure out who's responding to what. Whereas in talking, since you wait for the other person, you're almost always responding to the previous utterance. So there's a lot of differences. And so I hesitate to call the analysis that I do conversation analysis because there are those differences. I'm not talking about verbal conversation and not talking about face-to-face where you have gestures and so on. So here you have, you have different conventions, like KK is an agreement, okay. But that's something that you wouldn't say if you were speaking. I wouldn't, if you ask me a question, I'm not going to say KK to you. And I'm not going to use an asterisk in correcting a spelling error, because you don't make spelling errors usually in speech and so on. So there's a lot of differences. And like I say, one of the major things is looking at the threading, which you have to do in the chat, which you don't have to do in normal conversation analysis. So there are a lot of methodological differences in it. And there are a lot of advantages. So it's never the case that I can't hear what somebody said, because if it's in the chat, then I see exactly what they said with their misspellings and their emoticons and everything else they use, and capital letters sometimes and so on. So there are differences, and the method has to be adapted to the medium.
I think it's a fantastic short sequence, and it touches. We had a meeting late last night with Doug Macbeth via Skype on a chapter on instructions by Gothenburg, chapter 6 in 2002. And a lot of the themes that we discussed also tie to the things that we can see here, what it means to follow the instructions, what it means to follow a set of the instruction, and that also, so something that we discussed was also the limitations of conversation analysis, for instance, in doing that, because they mostly take an interest in the sequential organization of talk in interaction. And it's not just that this is about chat data, it's also that the progressivity of the interaction isn't oriented that much towards the communicative exchanges per se as it is towards fulfilling what the instructions ask of them. So there's another project there going on, which isn't that, like, if we just have a conversation, the communicative exchanges and the progression and the intersubjectivity involved in that might be the main topic or main theme of what drives this further. But in this case, it's very much other things. And I think the different kinds of instructions there are quite interesting also in regard to that, because in some cases it's quite definitive when you have completed the instruction. Click on that. Okay, now I have click on that. But chat about that. It doesn't have a definitive end, so you have almost to decide on where the end is. Like, and sometimes it's a bit vague, as in 75 there. So we just play around with it, because what's a very important part of instructions is that, that the assessment of the fulfillment of an instruction is in itself an important part. And for instance, in classroom situations, you have teachers quite often that decide whether you have fulfilled, whether this is the correct answer, the correct response to the instruction. Whereas here you have a group of students who doesn't have the means always to assess whether this was the relevant response. In some cases it's quite straightforward. You can see that you have fulfilled what the instructions asks of you. But what I find quite intriguing with these kind of settings is that at times it leaves the students to decide that for themselves. I think they do it quite nicely here, and they also have to make it quite explicit. So
yeah, they're in a very complex situation, as you point out. Conversation analysis often is just a couple friends talking informally without much constraint, at least explicit. Here, they know there's a teacher lurking in the background. The teacher has brought them together and said, you're going to work on this. And the teacher may even be walking around the room that they're in, whispering in the ears of groups or whatever, or looking over their shoulder. Or they know that this is persistent, so a teacher can always come and look in it and see, the next day what they did. So they're aware of that. It's been structured, I hope very carefully, the instructions to get a pedagogical impact. They're in the virtual, online environment, which is new to them, and there's a lot going on, and the instructions are open-ended in many ways to allow them to do exploration, so they have to negotiate how they're going to explore. So it is quite a complex situation that they're put into, and then they have to decide something like, are they finished working on a point? It's pretty complicated. So, is the teacher going to grade them on point 6, what they said about point 6 or point 8? What would that mean? What would be the criteria for having accomplished point 5 or whatever? Tom?
Well, it strikes me here that a lot of the negotiation about what the task is and how to approach it, and then when the task is finished, is actually very, very similar to face-to-face group work discussions. I think this is almost surprisingly similar. But what it strikes me as being significantly different is the level of precision in the language they're using. And I think that's because partly because you can't chat at the same time as you're gesturing in GeoGebra. So you can't go like this and say, that and mean a line segment. You have to say line segment. And in fact, at this grade level, I think it's quite unusual that they say line segment rather than line. I mean, in this middle school kind of grade level, I'm quite impressed by the precision of the language they're using here. And I think it's interesting, and I wonder the relationship of, like when you roll over those tools, are they popping up and saying, this is a line segment and stuff like that? So like I wonder, like the language where it's coming from, if it's coming from the tool in R.
Yeah, so we could look and see if it's coming from the instructions, the line segment tool, and when you click on this, it probably does say line segment, but the line itself over here, if you highlighted it, it would not say line segment, but the tool itself is called the line segment. In chat, so this is really another difference between speaking and text chat, is that text is a lot more explicit than spoken conversation in general. And that's an affordance as well as a challenge for people. People do often use deictic terms like that and so on in chat too, and I'm sure we'll see that over there.
Yeah, no, it was just a comment. I think it's, if you look at it historically, I think it's not so strange that we don't have exact methods and theories of how to approach this, because this is a new form of communication which has a set of affordances that are not there before. For instance, it's interaction, but it's written. And in this case, they're also operating under instructions all the time, so they have to accommodate to that. And this is a kind of activity that is relatively new, I think, in this sense. And so this idea that they are kind of, they have to fulfill a very complex task, which is where they have to be aware of the conditions under which they can coordinate and so on. And it has to have a structure, a progression, and they know that. So they're struggling with how to accommodate that, implement that process. But I think it's also this, if you think of it, spontaneous speech on the one hand, between two people who chat about whatever they choose, or whatever they find relevant in the situation. So this is a kind of planned activity where, first of all, the typing requires an explicitness in planning the speech, which is very different. And on top of that, it's an area, it's an issue, it's a subject, it's a content, the geometry about which is not easily accessible for them. And that takes another kind of planning that they have to bring into the task. So I think there is a very high level of meta-awareness when they're producing this speech, and they're learning how to do this. So this is a learning sequence, and that's it, but not just learning geometry. Because I've seen these GeoGebra used, are very popular in Sweden, but I think this socialization aspect to make the tool transparent and so is always underestimated. But it takes some adjustments to feel at home and to freely engage in geometry, because the task of the tool is quite complex as a communicative exercise.
Yeah, and the complexity of it is felt by the instructors as well. So the complexity or the subtlety of the instructions, it's not just for the students, how they respond to it, but how we, as the people who created the curriculum and the system, how we formulated the questions, the instructions. So we will change the wording of the instructions and the whole approach based on our analysis of how the students responded to it. In fact, this is how it read in March, half a year ago. In the course we're given now, it's been considerably changed. And within our research group, we're always debating the details of of how you word these things, and as well as the larger questions about how you approach it. How open-ended should it be? How explicit and guiding should it be? What kind of language should it use? And we try to make it minimal instruction so that it all fits in one tab, for instance. Now we've gone actually to making hints where you have to click somewhere and then it opens up more instructions for you if you want, and it's up to the group whether they want to expose those further instructions or not, whether they need them, they feel they need them, or maybe it's an extension of what they've already done, and so on. So there's that sort of dialectic between how we write the instructions and how we see the students responding to them. And not only students, but teachers, because we use similar curriculum for the teacher professional development, where they go through the same kind of exercises, but the language for them is somewhat different and more open-ended and so on, more reflective. Yeah. Annika?
Yeah, I think the open-endedness of the instructions seems to be working very well, because I like the line when they say, so we just play around with it.
Right.
And as we have seen in many other tools that are much more strict, we have, for example, in the virtual lab with Emma, we have a sequence when they say, let's gamble a little, which is very similar, just that they are not supposed to gamble. So when they do that, they don't play according to the rules, and they don't do the lab as they're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
But here they are allowed to, and we have seen that so many times, that what students do is that they sort of have this kind of iterative work and they try things out, and here it's part of the instruction to try the tool out and to explore.
Yeah, we want it to be as open-ended and exploratory and student-centered as possible, but we feel that in the first lessons, they have to learn so many things, like what the different buttons in GeoGebra do, that we have to provide some guidance for it. We can't just throw them in there and say, fool around, because we do want them to get certain understandings about the nature of geometry out of it. And they won't do that if they just fool around. Then they'll do drawings. They'll use it to do drawings of dragons or something like that, rather than triangles.
And according to what you asked, Thomas, I think it's very nice that you give them the right concepts, and they are actually using it. So that's sort of a way to internalize or learn about the different concepts and really use them.
So if we didn't test it, we'd have no idea, how to do it. And this has taken years of iteration, and is by no means final. Yeah.
I like the task because it's no doubt it plays an important role, so as conversation will take place as you imagine it. I wonder who prepared the task. Is it the team including the teachers? Who prepared the task? Is it your team?
Our research team, yeah.
The teachers were not involved, the teachers of the kids.
The goal of the teacher professional training course was that at the end the teachers might be able to make their own curriculum, but and some tried to do it. The teacher in this case used the first 4 lessons that we had prepared, and then tried her own lesson on another topic, and it didn't work well. And then she went back to 1 or 2 of our other lessons. Another teacher was much more ambitious and did their own whole set of curriculum on really another topic altogether, pre-algebra or something, pre-calculus, I mean, for advanced students. And but it's very difficult to, I mean, it's taken us years to do this, and to expect a student, expect a teacher in sort of their spare time over Christmas vacation or something to put together a curriculum is when they haven't had much experience with GeoGebra probably, or with online systems, or it would be asking a lot. And, our research team includes math educators. The research is done at the Math Forum, which is an online math education service. And most of the people who work there have been math teachers before. So they bring a lot of experience, of teacher-oriented experience. And then we run it through with groups of teachers, and we ask them a lot of questions about what they thought of it and how they would change it and so on. And we adopt those things to modify ours. So we do get a lot of teacher feedback into it, but not necessarily the teacher of these particular students. And since it's a research experiment, we want to use as much as we can the same curriculum across a number of groups, so we get a comparison, a range using the same fixed curriculum. So we don't, if every teacher went off and created their own instructions for their own students, then it would be hard for us to compare as a research project.
Sure how to formulate this, but it's something interesting in the relation between the chat as a chat and also what they are doing there, and the ties between those. Because I'm quite incompetent when it comes to this particular tool, and also perhaps to the mathematics used. I'm not sure what they are involved in, and therefore I'm quite unable almost to analyze what the real work here is. So what's handled in the chat is very much like the progression of the assignment, but perhaps not what they are supposed to be doing there. But it's things like what you in conversation analysis might be talking about in terms of turn taking or turn allocation, and also deciding when to move on and things like that. But like 75, 76, those lines, so we just play around with it, or now the triangle is bigger. It's not responses towards prior turns, it's responses to the kind of engagement with the thing there.
Right.
And that, we also talked about that yesterday, that it's so easy for us who's quite used to analyze interaction to stay on the level of interaction rather than the engagement with things, like in the handicraft material I've seen. On the level of interaction, it doesn't look different when you instruct someone to how to knit compared to how to crochet. It's the same kind of words, the same kind of gestures, but the difference between knitting and crocheting is that it's two different things. And if we want to say something, if we want to learn how to crochet, it's the crocheting we want to capture, not the general stuff. But in a sense, what the chat does, it's staying on more on this group, like handling the group kind of level.
Sometimes it does both.
Sometimes it, of course, expands much more, but in at least here in the beginning, it's quite interesting how the link there, and also the limits of CA, not just because this is chat, but because they are so much into
mathematics,
and not that much about like what you in ethno methodology might call like the phenomenal field of this math situation, scene.
Well, I mean, the question, mathematical question is how do they do the mathematics? It's an ethnomethodological question applied to mathematics. And it's certainly true that to interpret this data, you need people with mathematical understanding as well as interactional understanding. And that is an important difference between normal conversation analysis, is that you have the mathematics. You have to understand that. I mean, it's like, what's his name, the CA person who went into mathematics and wrote a number of books about mathematics from a CA perspective. I can't think of his name, but yeah, right. Livingston, yeah. So he went through graduate school in mathematics to get that expertise, already having the ethno background and so on, and made a real contribution to both fields by having that. So we have, on our team, we have obviously the math expertise, and people who come join our group and don't have a strong math background feel really a little out of place or unable to deal with some of it without having the math explained to them. Yeah, so, but I think to understand how the students are doing math in later sessions, you have to take an interactional perspective on how they're, because it's not just learning math, it's collaborative learning of math that we're interested in and that they're engaged in and that we're analyzing. So the collaborative part is important.
But that was almost my point, that it seems to be almost two streams. On the one hand, it's the engagement with the math.
Yeah,
And
at some point,
the group and the progression and the work. Of course, these sometimes touch or
yeah.
intertwine quite
Yeah.
much,
Yeah.
especially perhaps later on.
Right.
But right now it seems like it's two
Yeah.
parallel streams where, of course, a lot of more interactional issues. Like I was thinking about why they had troubles deciding where to do something in the beginning. But that is actually something that you find everywhere. The terror of being the first one to do something.
Uh-huh.
All the frights that are associated to be the first, especially when it's going out to do something unknown.
Yeah.
So that you could collect as something that you can find in many different settings, and it's more an interactional, social, general phenomena. Being the second one is not a problem, and it wasn't a problem here.
Mm-hmm.
And then someone wants to do it.
Right.
After that. So there's a lot of like group processes,
Yeah.
kind of things. But at the same time, I guess what you are after is especially the engagement with math, where I'm completely lost, I must confess.
Well, they haven't engaged in very deep mathematics yet.
But I've seen this.
Just mushing together.
I've seen this data before.
Right.
Like,
I think this is interesting. If you run into an epistemological problem, I don't think if it's fair to say that they're engaged in doing maths. They're engaged in trying to do something that occasionally, temporarily, or in short sequences would qualify as a mathematical argument or as a mathematical concept or something. So mathematics is not just a ready-made thing that they are approaching, but so there is some kind of developmental perspective involved in all of this, where they, on a few lines may do something that would qualify as mathematically relevant, and they may come out of that, they may come back to that, and that is also very important learning element. Within which framework are you supposed to stay in order for this to be mathematically relevant? So if you just say, I pull this over here, you follow what you're doing, but it's not necessarily very mathematically relevant contribution, although it may build up the understanding of the mathematical relationship. So they're kind of on the fringes between looking at at objects and artifacts and trying to coordinate with a language which they are vaguely aware of, but it doesn't appear to them as a ready-made structure that they can just impose on what they're doing. They have to, build up what is expected and what qualifies as a mathematical algorithm. And this takes time. It takes a long time.
Yeah, especially since that's not quite my goal, is to have them view mathematics as something ready-made out there that they apply then to what they're doing. I'd like to see them create the mathematics themselves through their interactions collaboratively. And so maybe we should move on to...
I was thinking it's worth pointing out that it's not even just mathematics, it's school mathematics.
Mhm.
It's a very specific kind of mathematics. And so they're not necessarily very used to creating their own mathematics. What they're used to is trying to fit what they do to an ideal of a school mathematics that's delivered
Right.
through the textbooks and the
And
teachers.
that's also true about math teachers, if I may say that in this setting. And so our goal at the Math Forum is to give math teachers in their professional development course a sense of doing mathematics that's different from their textbook learning of mathematics, say. And so this is a problem that I really like for getting a hands-on sense of doing mathematics. And the let's see. If we look at if we watch over here what they do, they start exploring quite a bit, just dragging around, which is the basic affordance of dynamic geometry, and is also their instruction. Take turns dragging vertex A of triangle ABC and vertex D of the inner triangle. Chat about dependencies you notice and what you wonder about this figure. And then construct a triangle inscribed in a triangle that behaves the same as this one. So there's two parts to it. The first part is to explore and discover the mathematics, if you will, of this figure, or the dependencies that are built into it. And then to construct your own version that has those same dependencies in it. So here they've been exploring it, the existing one. And eventually they're going to start to build their own. So that this takes about an hour that they spend on it. And at the very end, they quickly are successful at building their own. There's about a 20 or 30 minute interval where there's almost no texting, no chatting. And they're each trying to build something. And they're just experimenting like crazy in all sorts of directions without much planning, without much sort of mathematical guidance to it. And then in the end, they succeed. And if you just look at the chat log, so here's the key. The key discovery that Cheerios makes. So he says, as I was moving D, segment DA is the same distance, he means the length of the segment, as segment BE. So what he's saying is that as he moves a point like this distance is the same as this one and the same as that one there. So they move together. Those distances change dependently upon each other. and they're always the same, even though they may go down to 0, they may be fairly long, but those 3 are always the same. And that's the key discovery that they make by dragging the given figure that allows them to construct their own figure that behaves the same way. It's the only solution I know of to do that. It took me a few days, I have to admit, to figure it out. And they figured it out within an hour. So I guess mathematics is easier for young people to do. But really the lesson is mathematics is easier for groups to do, a lot easier for groups to do than it is for individuals. And we see that with the teachers too. This is my favorite problem to give people, so I give it to the teachers and their students. And the teachers, a group of teachers will usually figure it out in an hour, whereas you can tell that individually they wouldn't have been able to. They would have given up. The only reason I was able to do it is because I stuck with it for a few days. But most people wouldn't have stuck with it. But in the group, one thing the group does is supports you to stick with the problem, as well as sharing different approaches. So here they figured out this key. And so you have to understand the mathematics of the problem to see that this is really the key solution step right here, the solution discovery. The key discovery is right here. And Cheerios not only points it out, but draws the consequence that for building it, we have to have the same relationship going on. And she also says, use the compass tool, and that's the key tool to use to maintain this segment length. So right in this chat, it looks like Cheerios is doing the whole solution. So somebody who doesn't believe in collaborative learning would say, well, Cheerios as an individual, she just solved the problem and told the others, and the others just said, okay. But if you look then at the GeoGebra actions, you see that the construction, that Cheerios fumbled around trying to do this construction and wasn't able to, and the other 2 girls came along and did different parts of it. So the construction was a collaborative accomplishment that they all participated in. And it doesn't show up because they're not chatting about what each one's doing a lot. And you have to look at the details of the GeoGebra actions. And you can see that very, very quickly, very efficiently, the 3 of them working together were able to do that construction. This is one of the first major geometric constructions they did in GeoGebra. And it's quite it's a fairly sophisticated thing to do. You have to understand which tools to use and how to do it and so on. So I happened to see, looking at the logs, I happened to look at the logs of this group that night after they did it. And I emailed the teacher and I said, this group actually accomplished this quite challenging problem very nicely. And your other groups of students did not. And maybe you should extend the topic, because you see there were three tabs there. There was this tab here to do the same thing with inscribed squares, the same problem basically. And then there's even one to do it with inscribed hexagons, to really generalize. And I wanted to see if how they would do in these problems, having solved the inscribed triangle problem. And so the teacher had this group of 3 girls present to the class face-to-face how they solved the triangle problem. And then the teacher assigned another hour for all the groups to go on with the lesson. And the other groups were then able to do the triangle problem. And this group, Cheerios and Fruit Loops and Cornflakes, went on to the squares problem. Now, you may think that this looks pretty much similar to the problem, but the group had done a number of lessons with triangles and had never seen a square before. So, I mean, they've seen squares, but they've never constructed a square in GeoGebra. And so that took them about half an hour. And if you look through the GeoGebra actions, you see again, they did wild experiments all over the place using, they opened the grid and tried to line things with the grid to get the right angles and a lot of different things. And finally somebody, one or two or three of them, constructed a square in a very elegant way based almost exactly on Euclid's method for constructing an equilateral triangle. It's just a little variation on that method. So they did a beautiful job, but they did it through this wild experimentation. And then the interesting thing is that once they had the one square, the outside square, constructed, they immediately all understood how to do the inside one, which is a strict analogy to the triangle. And they were able to express it, and let's see, maybe I can find. Yeah, so here are this is the explanation of how they did the triangle. So when they came back the next session, they had accomplished the triangle problem at the very end of their session, so they didn't have time to chat about it. The teacher wanted them to chat about it. So here they explained how they did it, and they had a number of reflections upon it and upon why it worked, and upon so they use the compass tool, which makes a little circle around a point, and that constrains the point to be at a certain location on the circle, and then they hide the circle, and that point is still constrained by the hidden circle. So that's something important to understand, really crucial to understand in using GeoGebra, is that you can hide things that constrain where points have to remain. And here they're talking about that's true. They're really making explicit their understanding of that really important part of GeoGebra, which isn't, I mean, it's not a mathematical insight so much as how GeoGebra works as a tool. So here they're going over their understanding of what they did in the last session. Okay, so here they're starting to work on the square. So how do we create a square like the outer square? We have to talk about dependencies and stuff. So to me, dependencies, like I talked about yesterday, dependencies are really the heart of GeoGebra, understanding dependencies and how you construct things to have really, the geometry is a design process. You're designing a construction to embed dependencies in the figure. And here, so they've been working in this system now for 5 hours. And here they are, 14-year-olds, sitting around talking about dependencies in geometry. So I felt pretty good about that we had gotten across the point where they talk about dependencies, and elsewhere they talk about what's the difference between a dependency and a constraint, and partial constraints and so on. So they really spend some time chatting about that. So here they say, like, I know how to make the triangle, but now the square. They really don't know how to construct a square. They know it might, one way would be involving perpendicular lines, and there's a tool to create perpendicular lines. Another might be to line things up on a grid. But they really don't know how to do it. They can't conceptualize it, and they spend a lot of time experimenting, hands-on, which is great. And they succeed. And once they've created, like I said, once they create the outside one, they know right away, now we need to use the compass tool like we did in the triangles tab. Because if this segment is equal to that one, and that one, and that one, and then you use the compass tool to copy this distance to here, and to here, and to here, and then you get these 4 points, and then you can connect them up with the polygon tool, and you're done. So they know that right away. And they all agree, and it works, and they're able to accomplish it right away, and they understand that it works just like the original and they can hide the circles, and the circles still maintain the constraints. So they understand all of that stuff very quickly once they've been able to create the outside square. And to me, this is pretty strong evidence that all three of them have understood what they learned with the triangle, namely the technique of using the compass tool to maintain the dependencies between the different line segments, and use that as a basis for inscribing one polygon inside of another. And you can see that they all interact and agree on it. And there's a lot of agreement. They agree, they agree, they agree. And they're all quite happy and excited about their accomplishment here. So, so that finishes up their first 6 hours, and that's what I wanted to show you before we look at their final session. So, are there any comments at this point? Does that mean you buy what I say, or that you don't? You do. Okay, so so then their last, the last piece of curriculum shows them all of these four-sided polygons, quadrilaterals. So quite a bit of time in school geometry is spent defining a number of quadrilaterals that are considered special. There's a square, of course, where all four sides are equal. There's things I can never remember the definitions of. What's a rhombus versus a trapezoid and parallelogram? What are the differences between each of those? So there's these big Greek terms for special cases of quadrilaterals. And you sort of have to memorize them. It's textbook learning. So as an alternative to that, I take this approach, which is if you drew all the possible combinations of constrained four-sided figures, what would they be? Well, some can have different number of equal sides. You could have, if you have a four-sided figure, you could have no sides equal, two sides equal, three sides equal, four sides equal. If two sides are equal, they could be opposite sides or adjacent sides. And the same with angles. If you have four angles in there, so you could have no angles equal, two angles equal, three angles equal, four angles. You can have right angles. How many right angles can you have? Well, square has four. You could have one right angle, two right angles. Can you have three right angles? Can you? Can you have a quadrilateral with exactly three right angles? Why not? You can have 2 and 4. Why not 3? Right, so if you have 3 right angles, then the other angle has to also be a right angle. You can have parallel sides. You can have 2 parallel sides, or you can have 2 sets of parallel sides. You can have different, if you know about symmetry, you can have different characteristics. If you draw diagonals, they can either be bisecting or at right angles to each other. So there are various ways of constraining quadrilaterals. And you get, I don't know, here's 20-some different ones. Each of these happens to have a different constraint on it. And you can tell what the constraints are in dynamic geometry by dragging a point and seeing what happens. If you drag this point, are these 2 sides going to remain equal to each other? Are these 2 sides going to remain equal to each other? I don't know offhand until I drag them. Are these 2 sides going to remain parallel to each other? Are these 2 sides going to remain? So it's not, the important thing is not that this is called a rhombus, if it is, or this is called a kite, if that's what it is. The important thing is, what are the dependencies of one side on another side, or one angle on another angle? And that there's a lot of different constraints, sets of constraints that are possible. And let's explore them, and we can explore them very nicely in dynamic geometry. And can we create them? So somebody created all of these, me. So I know that it's possible to construct in GeoGebra quadrilaterals with these different combinations of constraints. And I think it would be nice if the students felt that they could do that too. That's more important to me than that they have memorized that rhombus means a certain set of constraints. And so this is the last exercise that these students did, not because it's the ultimate thing to do in geometry, but just that's how far they got in the time that we had. So I'm wondering if we should stop now for lunch and come back in the afternoon. Would that make sense? And then look. And I haven't really analyzed this log, so I'd like your help in doing that. And we can look at it in the replayer and in the spreadsheet log. So let's do that after lunch.
Okay, thank you so much. So far then. Should we be here?
Okay.
Can you hear? Tom, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Can I hear you in the camera? That's the question.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Okay, so we have some new people joining us. So quickly explain that what we want to do in this session is compare compare the collaborative learning that takes place in this, with this lesson in geometry with the sessions that you missed this morning. And so we saw this morning that it took a while for the students. There's quite a few people here who, well, 3 or 4 people who weren't here this morning. So there's three students, and their login names are Cheerios, Corn Flakes, and Fruit Loops. There are 3 about 13 or 14-year-old girls in this after-school geometry online experience. At this point, and they meet once or twice a week for about an hour online in an environment which looks like this. It has a chat and a GeoGebra panel with some curriculum and some geometry figures. And so they've met for 7 sessions previous to where we're starting now. And we start now with this is what they see in their GeoGebra panel. And this is the beginning of the chat log. And we can download, for research purposes, we can download the log as a spreadsheet and also as a replayer where we can replay the whole session. So if we look, and we can filter the spreadsheet. So here we have it with all the entries, including system entries of when the students came into the room, in the chat room, and what they did in the GeoGebra, like looking at the different tabs. So you see in this lesson there's 3 tabs. So there's 3 little instructional units in GeoGebra. And one's on quadrilaterals, one's about a square, and one's called constructing. And if you look in the full log here, you see that the 3 students each join the chat room. And the first thing they do before they start any chat, posting any chat, is they look around. So you can see Fruit Loops, Corn Flakes, and Cheerios are all switching tabs. So as soon as they come into the room now, instead of standing around and saying, hi, who are you? What should we do now? What's it say over there? They come in and immediately they scan through the whole lesson that's available to them, the 3 tabs. And then they start, and the first chat message is, let's start with quad ABCD. So you see that here. This one is just filtered to show their chat. So instead of saying, what should we do? Who wants to go first? And going on and on like that, they have a declaration. Somebody proposes, let's start with quad ABC, which was one of these here. It's a little off the screen here in the screenshot, but BC. So it's a quadrilateral. And they've been asked, can you tell how each of these quadrilaterals was constructed? So that they pick one to start with. So immediately they say, let's go ahead with that. And it's the one in the upper left-hand corner. And then Corn Flakes says, okay. And then Fruit Loops again says, so for polygon number 1, all the points can move anywhere, and I don't think they have restrictions. So she's already proposing an analysis of the first example of these many examples. And she's pointed to it so that everyone knows exactly what she's talking she's pointed to it in a number of ways. One was to call it quadrilateral ABCD using the lettering of the points, just like the ancient Greeks would have done. Then she says it's in the upper left-hand corner. And then she calls it poly 1, which if you remember it had that label on it, poly 1. So she's used 3 different ways. And then Cheerios says, label it by saying its points. So she's proposed sort of 3 different ways of pointing to it. And they discuss a little about which one would be the best to use to be consistent. So Fruit Loops here, I guess, has taken the initiative and has proposed where to start, what to call it. And here's her, first she says, I don't think they have any restrictions. And then she said, I think this was constructed by just making 4 points and using a polygon tool. So, so if you look at the instructions, it says, can you tell how each of these was constructed? And then drag the vertices to see what's special about each one. And it proposes different ways of differentiating these. You can have different number of equal sides, equal angles, and so on. And so again, here's poly 1, which is A, B, C, D, and it's in that corner. So that all makes sense. And if we scroll in the replayer, we can see that somebody is moving poly 1 around and then poly 2. Quite a bit, because it's a pretty interesting, complicated one. Then they start on poly 3. So they're going pretty efficiently through 1, 2, 3, 4, and dragging them around and exploring them dynamically as befits dynamic geometry. So, so I haven't yet really tried to analyze this. I was just struck that the difference in efficiency between how they started out in their first session and how quickly they move and do things pretty quite efficiently as a group to collaboratively respond to the instructions. And they make proposals about the answers to the questions and instructions, and then they agree or disagree. Meanwhile, they're in the GeoGebra tab, they're exploring it, and everybody can see how somebody is dragging it. So those 2 things are going on simultaneously, and somehow they're coordinating it and reaching their conclusions. Tom?
Has anyone noticed that they can make shapes that aren't quadrilaterals? I mean, you can see when they're dragging around, they cross line segments and end up with...
Uh-huh. You think that's not a quadrilateral?
Well, I mean, it depends how you look at it.
So like
So
here,
like there, yeah.
here you have like, it's like 2 triangles.
Depends whether you consider that to be an intersection or not.
Whether this is an intersection here where the
Yeah.
lines cross. It's not labeled
No?
as a... How many sides does this figure have? How many line segments is it composed of?
Well, mathematically 4.
And what's the definition of a quadrilateral?
Yeah, it has 4 sides, but I mean, there's some aesthetic uncertainty there. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. I just wondered as it came out, because it struck me that the software responds to the requirements, the geometric requirements, like you've talked about so much. And then in this case, it can create something which can be quite ambiguous for the student to look
For
at.
anybody, yeah. I have the same reaction you do when I see suddenly something that obviously looks like a four-sided figure becomes something that looks quite a bit different and more complicated and questionable as to what kind of figure that really is. And also, as a geometrician, you have to wonder what characteristics of these simple quadrilaterals still apply when you do something like that to it. Like, is the area calculated the same way? Does it still have four vertices? If you have dependencies, for instance, if these two line segments have to be the same length, if they're constructed to always be the same length, is that true when you cross like this? It actually raises fairly advanced mathematical questions of topology, a field that is much more modern than Euclidean geometry. And to really, for instance, axiomatize, as Christian, who was here this morning, would say, I think, as a mathematician, that to really analyze all that happens in something like this, you need to bring in the rules of topology, which were not available in Euclid's time. Because topologically, this is a very different shape than this. This has one inside, this has two inside areas. To get from any point inside here to any other point, you don't cross any lines. To get from a point here to a point here, you have to cross two lines. Very different structure. And that happens just by dragging one of the points. It is pretty striking. But I don't see them reacting to that.
Different thing. In relation to having new people in the room, I think the two first slides are quite interesting. That on the one hand, you have these explicit indexical expressions like the quad ABCD in the upper left-hand corner. But those references might be understandable for the people that just came here. It's point towards something that is there to be seen, whereas the start, let's start, what that means, I guess would be quite hard for Alexandra or anyone else that didn't take part in that. So the efficiency is...
What does it mean, let's start?
To do these things that they have done previously, like which they now have a history of, and they don't have to spell it out what they should do, those things that in the beginning were quite vague, and they have tried out. And
like how to follow the instructions.
Yeah, because it doesn't say let's start with what, it's just with what as in that thing, but what that procedure means or practice means. They don't have to say that because they have jointly done it before. So it's deeply indexical to the prior attempts, and I guess that is why you can be much more efficient, and why it's almost impossible to follow what this means. By you having this presentation this morning, that gave us the resources at least to get a glimpse of what let's start mean, even though we might have to start again if we were really attempting ourselves.
So from a conversation analytic viewpoint, this is a reference back, like Oscar's pointing out, back to previous conversation. And so it's bridging between two different two different excerpts of interaction that are kept apart temporarily because it's been a couple days since the group was together. Now suddenly they're together again, and they're bridging back to their previous understandings as a group and previous practices of working together that have evolved so that they can do it so efficiently now. Also, I love that they start using the letters A, B, C, D as the points, that's a practice that the very earliest Greek geometers in 500 BC started. It was a revolutionary new medium to take letters. First of all, I guess Greek was the first language that had an alphabet. And so these early Greeks, who were the first people who wrote using an alphabet, took the letters of the alphabet and labeled geometric points with them. That was just a huge intellectual step. And here these girls now have picked up on that pretty quickly and are using it in their own interaction.
Not only using it, but also like in 17 emphasizing that it's that use. And
right,
not
label it by saying its points. This whole thing of labeling something by using a letter to say its points.
Two different modes of it's both quad A, B, C, D and in the left-hand corner. So 17 is like you don't have to say upper left hand. Stay with the A, B, C, D.
Right. Because that's a pretty confusing diagram here. It has all these points. It has 100 points on it, right? And so how do you, as a group who wants to focus, so collaboration, central to collaboration is sharing a focus. We're going to talk about, let's start by talking about this object here. Okay, so let's all look right here and talk about that. Let's not be looking around here. Let's not be jumping to different tabs. They're saying right there in the first thing, let's all look right at this one object. This one object consists of 4 vertices. It has a label poly 1. It's located at this position on our screens. And let's start with this object, and let's all focus together on this object. And that's our shared perception. Our shared perspective is looking at that. And then talk about that in terms that the instructions tell us to talk about. So they're doing all of this stuff, which is using the affordances of this new medium, which is new to them, of geometry, with labels. And coordinating their collaboration, which includes focusing on a shared object, a shared focus. And they're doing it quite efficiently as the first statement in this chat.
And something that also makes it quite efficient in relation to the previous ones is that in the previous it was a lot of questions of the type, what do you think, or what should we do? Whereas here they rather offer candidates with connected to different modals like I think or I don't think, which still invite other people, but invite them to confirm or disconfirm specific offers.
Right, which is much more efficient, right?
Yeah.
If I say, should we start with quad A, B, C, D, or let's start with, somebody can object and say, no, let's start with something else. But it's not wide open. It gives a candidate. And in fact, the others agree right away. And so effectively, they've reached a conclusion. Whereas if you said, where should we start? Then someone else would have to say, well, there's a lot of places we could look at, and maybe we should do this one, maybe we should do that. And it could take a long time like it did in their first session.
It's very interesting too, I think that in 24, they're so direct now about seeking agreement. And You know, before there was like a lot of negotiation around agreement, and here it's, so you do agree with me how I think it was constructed. I mean, it's like really specific. Now we can move on. It's a very different style of interaction than in those first clips.
Right. So for collaboration, it's important that they keep confirming that they're all at the same place. They're all looking at the same thing. They're all talking about the same thing. They're agreeing on conclusions that they reach as a group. But there are more and less effective ways or efficient ways of doing that. So some kind of questioning or openness that elicits the other people to respond and agree or disagree is important. And there are different ways of doing that. One is an open-ended question, or here is a modal proposal that invites people to agree to a certain thing or to disagree with it. Yep.
So I wasn't here this morning, and I also don't understand geometry, so this is a little tricky. But I was wondering how they're handling the turn taking. I don't know if you talked about the setup of this, how they did this exercise, but if they are able to see how the other are handling the device, or if they have is it only one person who can move the cursor at
Right.
the time?
So there's this button in the GeoGebra tab. So first of all, are you familiar with GeoGebra at all?
I don't understand.
Okay,
like,
GeoGebra
the
is
math.
GeoGebra is a dynamic geometry software tool.
Okay.
So it allows you to create geometric shapes like this with certain features that are important to the mathematics of geometry. But it allows you to do it in a way that you can drag things around, like you can drag points, and you construct a quadrilateral with 4 sides and 4 vertices, but it's not fixed, so you can drag it around, and it still stays connected to itself. And if you drag, so for instance, these 2 sides, I don't know, they may have been created to be the same length always. So no matter how you drag it, these 2 sides, they might get shorter or longer, but they'll always be the same as each other. Something like that. So that's what makes dynamic geometry special. And then we took this GeoGebra environment, which already exists, is used in Sweden quite a bit and around the world, and we made it multi-user, which means that in this case, 3 students sitting at different computers see the same thing. And when one person drags it, they all see it being dragged, just like we saw it. But only one person can do the actual dragging at a time. So there is strict turn taking in that sense. And there's a button for one person to take control or release it. And then they can talk about who's going to take control next, or in the chat if they want to. The chat itself is different from speech in that there's not that kind of turn-taking that's normal in face-to-face speech, where if you're talking, I usually stop, and I indicate, or you indicate when you're finished, and then I might take over. And so those rules of conversation don't apply in text chat. So there's turn-taking in the sense that the chat postings are in a certain order, and everyone sees them in the same order. They get posted in a certain order. So there's turns in that sense, but everyone can be typing at the same time, unlike speech, where we don't usually all talk at the same time. So it has that different kind of structure.
So that means that there are actually 2 different turn-taking systems
Yes.
going on simultaneously,
Yes.
which might be quite
Yes.
very interesting to see
Yeah.
how that's handled. And this take control, that means that there's actually one way of sort of forcing to take the floor. So if nobody, but someone always has to have the
No.
floor in that, right?
You
It
can
says
see there.
nobody
Oh,
has
okay,
nobody has
sorry.
control right now.
I can also not read, I forgot.
No, of course not.
Okay, yeah.
But
So-
and also, Tom pointed out, you can't really be dragging things and typing chat at the same time, just physically. If your hands are dragging things,
Oh,
they're
okay.
probably not.
Yeah.
In theory, it would be possible, I guess, to use one hand for each, but it would be quite unlikely. So there's also that turn taking, a third kind of turn taking, that the person who's doing the GeoGebra manipulations is taking a turn at that rather than at chatting. And then your eyes too, there's an issue of where people are looking. Are they looking at the chat, or are they looking at those objects? So we actually have, you know, some researchers study with eye tracking devices to see who's looking at what part of the screen. So that can be a research issue as well.
One thing with the manipulations that once you have control, you can drag the points around, and that is sort of the way that you should discover dependencies
Right.
or restrictions.
Exactly.
But you can only discover them, or there should be a difference between you know where your hands are moving, where the mouse is going, and then you discover if the points sort of follows that direction or not.
Okay, so that's
for the one who's doing that operation, that's something to be discovered, right? Whereas for the others who don't know where that hand is on sort of the projection of it.
That's right. When I have control, then I see my cursor going on a certain point and dragging it. But other people don't see my cursor. So they could. In theory, the software could be designed to show the active cursor, but it's not.
But I also mean where you try to move those that cursor. I'm not sure if it follows or if it sort of sticks with the point, but there is some part of that action isn't visible for others. It's only tactile phenomenon that the manipulator, so to speak, is. So the discoveries that are being
So
put into place there are different, I guess.
This is what it looks like to everybody else who's not dragging that point around. So they don't see a cursor. They don't see actually which point is being dragged, although you could figure it out if you went slowly. That's probably point J that's being dragged now. It is, for the person who's doing the dragging, you see it pretty much following the cursor exactly, the point.
But I think what Jonas also is after is that it can be a very purposeful exploration where you almost test some hypothesis.
Yeah, oh yeah.
But that testing in itself isn't obvious for anyone.
So we tried to...
It might,
for
for
a long
some
time,
expert you can perhaps draw out what that
We try to
particular
prompt
move.
the students to first put in the chat what they're going to do, then do the dragging, and then type in the chat what they did. So they might type, they don't, but they might type, I want to see if those two sides, if sides AB and CD are always the same length, so I'm going to drag point C. And then they go and drag it all over the place. And then they say, well, I found out that they are always the same, or always appear to be the same length. But they don't in fact do.
But is it, I mean, the point of having that hypothesis, where is it purposeful rather than just go and play around and see?
So the prompt that they're given here was, can you tell how each of these quadrilaterals was constructed? What are its dependencies? So and then it says drag the vertices of these quadrilaterals to see what is special about each case. So presumably their dragging is to answer those questions.
But there's things like, I guess an example of what I was kind of getting at. Let's say there was this dependency in one of those that the two angles have to maintain a certain ratio, say. That would be fairly immediately appreciable if you were the one manipulating it, but would be very difficult to see if you weren't the one manipulating it. So there's, and when I just look at all those quadrilaterals there, I can't see any of the dependencies. I can make wild speculations, but I can't make any kind of educated guess about it. So, and that requires direct manipulation to do it, which I can't have by watching someone else do it. So there's something in that if one here you see a student says, you guys can try moving it if you'd like. So then there's other students are relying on that student's description of what's happened rather than having that direct experience themselves.
And that might actually be a strength. Of course, going back to the transcript here, that there is a hypothesis here, and both the other students are trying it out. So in a way, you have the kind of order you asked for, but not on an individual level.
Yeah.
But you have it like,
Right.
You don't have to say what you're trying out.
So they do.
The other person's
This
afterwards.
is the hypothesis.
Yeah.
I'm going to drag to
Yeah.
find out if that's true. And then here's the conclusion after they drag. So I think it was constructed without any constraints, and now you guys can try it too. But you've already seen me drag it around.
But there might be a need in order to like really believe it for yourself.
But
Yeah.
this case is also, I guess, the simplest one,
Yeah.
where you have no restrictions, no
Right.
dependencies. And to discover that, you test each one of the 4 points, and then sort of that should be settled. But should try to discover and pick up more complex relations, and maybe they
Well,
would,
maybe we'll
would
see.
need to try it. I'm not
Maybe
sure.
we'll see in the data as we go along. But the issue of watching somebody else drag was a technological issue for us. So the software generates a message each time you move something a pixel. So if you drag something like that, that might make 100 messages or 200 messages. And furthermore, you're dragging a quadrilateral which consists of 8 or 9 geometric objects that are changing. So you're having messages about 8 or 9 objects 100 times a second, and you're sending this over the internet to an unknown number of other chat instances. And if you have, if the system is used by thousands of students around the world, it becomes quite a bit of internet traffic on your server. So you can't send all of that. So first, the simple solution is just to have the end states. Here are the points here. When you finish dragging, it's over here. But then you miss something which is really an important part of dynamic geometry, is watching things being dragged around. And you can see how much fun it is to see objects dragged around. And so then we compromised. We said, so we'll send every 10th message. And then we, this little dial here is a threshold, and I can choose how fine the detail of dragging is, both in the replayer here, but also in the system itself. So if, for instance, as a teacher, I set up the room, and I know that it's going to be really important for students to see each other dragging in quite a bit of detail, then I set it for a high threshold of a lot of points along the way. And if I know it's less important and they're going to be moving very complicated 12-sided polygons all around the place, then I change it to a different setting. So it can be tuned. So that question of how well you see what other people are dragging became an important technological issue. So moving through the chat now to another excerpt a little bit further down. I thought this was an interesting one because they begin to really discuss the vocabulary of constraints and dependencies and restrictions, which is, to me, the core of dynamic geometry. And it's sort of giving students a model of how causality in the world works. in this abstract world of geometric figures. And it's also a way of looking at geometry as a design field. I design geometric objects to have certain dependencies in them. And I have tools for doing that. And I have a planning process, a design planning process. And so I would like to use dynamic geometry as a way of getting students to start thinking about things in those terms. And so when I get data like this, where I think I can see maybe how they're developing those concepts, that becomes quite interesting potentially. So that's why I'm presenting this excerpt. So Cheerios says, what is the difference between constrained and restricted? So in the prompts in the curriculum, it uses some of these terms, like here's the word dependencies, having to do with how they were constructed, and then asking them eventually to, well, I guess in the next, yeah. So in the third tab of this instruction, it says, take turns constructing each of the different kinds of quadrilaterals with different constraints. So in the first panel, it asked them to drag things and discover the constraints. And here it's asking them to design how to construct those kind of figures with those constraints themselves. So in the previous one, it talked about dependencies. Here it's talking about constraints. And other pieces of curriculum that they've had up till now use those terms too. And here they're trying to tease apart what these different terms mean and come to some kind of joint understanding about these terms, which I feel are important to what I'm trying to get across to them. So what's the difference between constrained and restricted? So Cornflakes proposes constrained is a limited function, and Fruit Loops responds, so I think G is definitely constrained. And here they talk about whenever you move E and F, then G moves. So there's a dependency relationship, a specific instance. And so Fruit Loops, so here's a turn-taking issue. Fruit Loops wants to respond, well, she's not responding to the previous post, which was her own. She wants to respond and make it clear that she's responding to Cheerios. So she uses this convention from tweeting, I guess, to say, Cheerios, I'm responding to you. I think it's constrained because it moves, but in a limited way, but the function is limited. And then she asks, what's the definition of dependent? And then Cornflakes starts talking about invisible circles and the shapes that could be dependent on those circles. So this references back to, at least to what we looked at this morning about the inscribed triangles, which were created using the compass tool to make circles. And the circles were used to copy lengths of segments. And once they were used, you could hide them. So they were still effective in determining relationships of dependency, of lengths and so on. But they were no longer visible. And so here Cornflakes is making the point that shapes can be dependent upon the circles that were created in constructing the figure but are no longer visible, which is fairly sophisticated understanding of how this geometry works. So, what do you think of this discussion of dependency?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because when you started the first two utterances in the first one, as you said, they used A, B, C, and D, but what they used, what they actually saw in front of them, the visible available to them. So there's a tension with what type of sort of framework they were saying. I think, but here you see how they kind of start to engage with where what they see is actually example or something. It is something that has a generative qualities which are not just in what you see. So I think this is a step towards appropriation or something here. But can I just ask you one thing? This notion of dependency, is that a GeoGebra expression or would a classic geometries talk about it in that way? Because dependency is very much what you see here in this relationship. But when you did it on paper and pencil, you would only see the end states, as you say. Here you see the process of moving from one configuration to another one. Would a classical geometry that when you talk about dependencies as well? Or is this contingent on this particular tool? Because here you really see contingencies in a very obvious manner. You see that, or dependencies, I'm sorry, if you do some things with some part of the object, something will happen with the other parts as well. But I just tried to look at GeoGebra, I couldn't find it. I guess what I'm after is if they are still operating within the particular frame that is given by GeoGebra, or if they are kind of starting to use concepts and understanding that are somehow independent of a particular.
So I got the idea of dependencies from GeoGebra, and it's a core concept in the software of GeoGebra.
Yeah.
And so you can get a view in GeoGebra that shows a list of all the objects. So these are all points, and these are their coordinates on the screen. And lines are well, they're defined by equations and so on. But notice that in GeoGebra, they make a distinction right here in the interface between free objects and dependent objects. And this is not just for the users, but in the software itself, the most important thing in the software of GeoGebra is that it maintains a hierarchy of dependencies among the objects. So there is a data structure in the that's maintained in the software that says that point F, point G, and point H, and so on, are dependent upon each of them upon some of these. And that structure is explicitly maintained in the software. So, and that's what causes it that if you move point A,
Yeah.
then all the other points move with it.
Yeah. But what my point is that if you would have, let's say you had two mathematics teachers who knew nothing, but who were fairly skilled at doing elementary geometry, who never saw GeoGebra, had no idea of GeoGebra, would they still talk about the objects as you, and normally, so they would make one object, one end state, and then another end state. They would never do the transformations of it. Would they still talk about these as dependent upon each other? This notion of dependency?
I'm not sure, because it doesn't become It doesn't get foregrounded in traditional geometry
No.
because it's when you drag things that it becomes visible.
So this is another form of mediation in that sense too, that you introduce a concept of dependency in order to show a more process-like understanding of geometric figures than you would have traditionally, where you would calculate the area of one and then the other, or the angles of one or the other. And this dependency would not be coordinated.
I mean, the modern view of geometry is it's an axiomatic system.
Yeah.
And you look at the constructions as really as a proof using axioms, as a logical inference or deduction. When I started playing around with GeoGebra myself, I was struck by this concept of dependencies. And I saw that it was built into the software, that it's very important in the software. It's the central.
That's what makes it dynamic.
Yes. And then I started looking at the research literature. And people don't talk about dependency. And I was quite struck by that. And also I felt that this notion of dependency was very closely linked to proof or understanding. The proofs I found, they all derive pretty much from the dependencies that are constructed in. And I thought this was really central to dynamic geometry. And I couldn't find any discussion of it in the research literature. So, and I talked to people, and the people who developed Geometry Sketchpad and GeoGebra and Cabri, they're all very conscious, the programmers are very conscious of this thing about dependency. And it doesn't surprise them all that it's related to proof. But they're the only ones. The research literature doesn't talk about it. And especially the pedagogical literature only talks about dragging. It's though dragging was the only important thing that's been introduced here. And I think they're missing the really deep structure of the affordance of dynamic geometry, which is dependency.
But at the same time, it is another way of trying to focus the learner on something which you wouldn't do on paper and pencil,
Right.
because there was not, that affordance was simply not there. So I think it's a remediation of the teaching of algebra, which is geometry, which is important.
Going from the math to the introduction, I think it's quite interesting how Cheerios question, why there, or the first question, which is like she signals that she's not.
Which line are you on?
51. First, there's a question in 44. And she marks out that she's not totally satisfied with the answer. But then in 54 and 55, or 54, 56, there are two different responses. So there's an okay and then an oh, I see. So the first is rather something like a continuum, whereas the other is more change of state token kind of thing. So the OK is probably directed towards 52, whereas the OIC is to the 53. So you have this, which becomes very chat typical, where the responses isn't where you expect them to be. And I think this is very nice, because you would hardly have a OK, I see in that order, because these are quite different types of responses.
Yeah, you could have okay, I see, but not okay, oh, I see.
No, because O marks it out as something newsworthy being presented.
Right.
So that is quite nice, and it's also nice that that thing is followed by, because 56 is still just a claim of the understanding. Whereas 57 then become a display of the understanding, so which is an even stronger thing from an outside perspective, since then you could either confirm it or disconfirm it. You can't confirm or disconfirm just a claim.
Mhm.
So I think the structure of this sequence is very nice in that it points towards the whole, what it means to pose a question and what kind of contributions you then could provide in order to get more response. And I also was reminded by, for instance, Tim and Alan's work on the surgeons, where you have a clerk, a student, as part of the surgery, where they tend to focus on side sequences. That is, sequences where they leave the surgery in order to show something. Look at this funny thing, which isn't part of the surgery, it's part of the more educational. In some sense, I guess this is a side sequence. It's partly leaving the actual assignment, and I think educational settings is quite filled with side sequences, that you have assignments which in a sense invite side sequences. You want the students to have side sequences. You want them to explore other things than just doing the assignment. And I think different types of assignments invite these kind of advanced side sequences to more or less degree. That I've seen lab work, for instance, where there are no things like that. They just complete the lab in ways that doesn't engage with the content at all. So looking at different, like picking out the side sequences and look at what, especially those that are initiated by the students themselves, seems like a promising way into interesting stuff.
May I ask you something? What's the criteria to speak of it as a side sequence?
In the surgery, it's easy. Yeah. No. I'm not sure in this. In the surgery, it's quite easy because like you're doing a procedure and then you're like, look here. What is this called? That's quite clear. Here, I'm not sure at all, because it could be.
I think it depends on your analytical gaze.
Yeah. And
if you would call it a side sequence.
Yeah, you're right.
You can look at it, the participants treat as a side sequence. I mean, that would be sort of the way to, I guess, if they sort of try, to get back.
So are they doing that here or not?
In 58, I think Euclid is trying to get them back to the questions they are to answer, I think.
From 48.
58.
Right, this 58 is
She's trying to say that,
reference
okay, we
back
have an assignment to do here.
to the next step in instructions.
Back now and you can.
Because he said already on 48, he said something which is definitely constrained.
Yeah.
And then, but it's very hard to argue that it's a site.
I think what side sequences mean in activities which are more project-oriented is something quite different from what side sequences mean in conversation as well. So here it's like different layers of activities going on at the same time, or something.
Yeah, so it's very hard to get students away from just going through a series of tasks and thinking that their job is just check them off. We did that one, we did that one, we did that one. Don't have to think about anything, we're done. And to get them to start thinking. So I want them to think about dependencies in general, conceptually, and talk about that. So that's why I love this, I think I love this excerpt here, or at least it looks attractive to me to think about what's going on there. So is this reflection on the concept of dependencies, is this aside from dragging those objects around or constructing them. Well, it's not completely, because the instructions were, can you tell how each of these quadrilaterals was constructed, namely by dragging it around. But it also says, what are its dependencies? And so to do the task, answer the question, what are the dependencies of each of these objects, you have to know what the word dependency means, at least have some kind of operational sense of it. And so somebody thinks that they're not sure what that means. And so that prompt there to do a certain thing involves this. So in that sense, it's not aside from that. It's a direct response to the wording of the instructions. Yeah.
Yeah, and the whole setup. I mean, the purpose of having a task is sort of contrary to having a surgery. I mean, it's designed to have people reflect and talk
Yes.
and struggle with things, not for them to be able to get to the answers right. That's in this design. So you want them to bump into these obstacles and then have to talk about how should we understand this.
Yeah.
That's the whole purpose. But you can't really just tell them, discuss dependencies. That's
Right.
not a fruitful way either. So I think the relation between ordinary conversation, other kinds of work, and educational tasks are really, I mean, it's very different orders to those activities.
I think it's quite nice the way that they formulate themselves. If you look at 52, they very much formulates an answer in relation to what they have done on the screen. Genius when they're being or generic and so on. And then it's reformulated because it knows what the functions and everything. And then they start asking for a definition of dependence. So they are trying to find a generic formulation which incorporates the kind of experiences that they have been making while working within this environment. I think you can look at the data from that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Reformulations that are less and less dependent on the actual
But still situated
relation. Yes,
in.
grounded in that group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I think this idea of the invisible circles that are constraining things. So when you look at the objects, the geometric objects, the constraints are invisible. So when I created these quadrilaterals, I used circles to establish the constraints on the different figures, so that some of them, like this one here, is probably a rectangle, and it probably always has right angles in it. And these two sides are probably always equal, and these two sides are equal. And to get that, I had to use some kind of circles around things, a whole set of them, or some kind of tools that I then hid and made invisible, but are still effective there. And so the idea of dependencies is really looking for some kind of causal connections that are not visible, which is a fairly philosophically kind of sophisticated thing going on. And they're getting at that. They're understanding that there are these invisible geometric objects as well as the visible ones. And the invisible ones are constraining the visible ones. Okay. I think this is a direct continuation of the discussion. So it has to do with how it was constructed. Yeah, and then they reference back to their previous sessions. So they take something that happened in a previous session and they bring it into the current context of the current discussion and make it part of that. So they take these invisible circles that were used to construct stuff before, the square and the inscribed square and the inscribed triangle, and now apply it within the context of these quadrilaterals. So in collaborative learning for the group, so each of the individual students may or may not have certain memories of what they experienced previously. And we don't really know about that, and they don't know about each other's internal memories. But here, one of them, Fruit Loops, has made explicit and shared some statement about what happened to them as a group before, and brought it into this current context, and situated it in there. And now that's available for all of them to build on. So it's this statement here becomes part of their group memory, and then they can build on it just like individuals build on their own memories to explain things happening in the present. And so Fruit Loops brings it in, Cheerios and Corn Flakes agree to it, and you know, they agree that this is part of their shared memory. And Cheerios even explicitly points back to the same thing that Fruit Loops was pointing back to. So here they're mixing together sort of theoretical things, their memories from the group memory from before, what took place there, what's visible and what's not visible here, and also the tools, the technology that they used. A certain GeoGebra tool, the compass tool, was critical to it. And all of those things get interpenetrate each other. There's different dimensions of thinking about it, all come together and support each other to try to understand this notion of dependency. And not just an abstract notion of dependency, but a notion that will allow them to then construct quadrilaterals that have the same dependencies as the quadrilaterals that they dragged around.
It just struck me that they don't write about the properties of the points or of the vertices in themselves. They write about, they don't talk about the construction of the shape as a shape. They talk about the construction of the shape as a process. Like they're speaking about unpacking the design process that you've done, not a fixed shape that's there. It's quite a different thing in some ways. That I don't know what it really means, but it doesn't. The conversation isn't about the construction in front of them. It's about the process. It's about construction as a process, not as a object.
I think that's really interesting, and two things come to mind. One is that's the nature of dynamic geometry.
Yeah.
That it is process oriented. And the other thing is that what they're interested in, these dependencies, are invisible. So they can't just talk about what's there as a visible object. They have to talk, to get at the things that are there invisibly, they have to understand the process that went into the construction.
partly might it have to do with what they have done before, actually having constructed it.
Right.
So a lot of the experience they have with these are by construction, and the tools they have used to make these are perhaps the way they have started to think about the shape. So if you only had read about this in textbooks, you would probably not have had this construction kind of entrance into the understanding of what the dependence is. But given that you have played around a lot with these tools, it becomes quite natural to make those distinctions between based on the different tools you have.
Because I think it's interesting because and it kind of highlights the difference of doing geometry this way. Because I don't think I've ever seen an example in a class where they get a figure from a teacher or out of a textbook and then start talking about how the person that drew it did it.
Because here it becomes very natural to see these as constructed objects, because they have constructed similar objects themselves.
Yeah.
So they are doing some kind of backwards
Right.
engineering here.
Yeah.
And that becomes the project.
So when they constructed the inscribed triangles, they stopped chatting for about 25 minutes and were totally engaged in the process of construction in a rather unorganized way, perhaps, but it was a complex process that they were all engaged in. And in the same way, when they constructed their first square, it was a half hour of crazy experimentational process. And that's what I try in the curriculum, try to get them to understand that design process that goes into the construction. And I think Euclid understood it. If you look at his first proposition on equilateral triangle, it's a construction process. First you draw this line, then you draw this circle and this circle. The circles become invisible, even in Euclid. You end up with just a triangle, and you don't necessarily see the circles anymore. So that's all there for Euclid. It's at the heart of geometry, but it's forgotten when geometry is taught, usually, in the textbook. And that's where I feel dynamic geometry has the potential to bring that back into it in a way that I think would thrill Euclid and the early, but has been lost for most of the 2,000 years since then. Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
That's cool.
Yeah, I think this is fascinating. Things that you just said. Would a teacher in geometry recognize this talk as relevant? I mean, the vocabulary.
No, they wouldn't. And that's why we give professional training to the teachers first, so they have this experience. Our professional training is basically nothing but having them get the same experience, plus a little more reflection, so looking at some of the logs like this. Because otherwise they don't. And teachers around the world, they get GeoGebra, which has, to me, this incredible potential of, you know, recovering what was lost 2,000 years ago from Western civilization. And what do they do with it? They say, well, we don't have time to teach custom tools. In fact, we don't have time to teach construction at all. So all the process goes right out the window. And they say, well, I'm going, as a geometry teacher, what I'm going to do is I'm going to download some pretty pictures of GeoGebra from the web, and I'm going to put them up on my smartboard in front of the room and show them to the students. And I'm going to say, this is a nice picture of a rectangle and a rhombus and a trapezoid, and they're beautiful pictures. And I can display on them the lengths of the sides, so they see, yes, these sides are equal, and I display the area very easily and accurately. And that's it. And it's really reducing it to the same as a textbook for the students. And the students are sitting back in their seats falling asleep or doing whatever students do, Facebooking if they can, or knitting or whatever.
And this means that you're reinventing the vocabulary, the specialized vocabulary of geometry.
Yeah,
reinventing or reintroducing or
reviving,
with this
re-energizing, resuscitating.
I mean, this loss of, because, you know, the Greeks, their focus was geometry. They didn't have any other tools really, right? And like, I mean, they did, but we've got algebra. And I mean, I guess that's what, we've become so focused on symbolic notation that we've lost so much of this ability, or we neglect to teach so much of the things that form geometry at the ground
Yeah, but I
level.
think the same things could probably be said about algebra. You can use GeoGebra
Yeah.
for algebra, for pre-calculus, and do the same things. I think I haven't tried to develop curriculum for that, but I'm sure that you could reintroduce the idea of experimentation and hands-on experience, dragging things. So you have a graph, you know, a parabola that has a certain equation, and you can change either the equation or drag the graph around and see how the equation changes. And you can really get a feel for that as a process. And you can design an equation to have certain kinds of graphs. And so a lot of the same things can be done. And certainly in pre-calculus, you can see things going towards the limit in various ways that make things visible and tactile that you can't do in textbooks.
Just a reminder of that they are talking about process and construction. I mean, it's also in the task formulation.
Right.
So you shouldn't forget that is that's in there. Then, of course, students don't necessarily have to talk about what's in the task formulation. So that they do that is itself interesting. But the relation is also tied into what the task is.
Yeah, so one of the things we saw in the first example this morning was there was a prompt to have the students talk about what they noticed in a construction. And they didn't talk at all about what I wanted them to talk about. Here they're talking about exactly what I wanted them to talk about. So they've learned to do what I want, in a sense. Or I've learned to prompt them. Anyway, a process has developed where they're now talking about what I considered deep concepts of geometry. Whereas in the first session, they talked about very superficial appearances. Now they're talking about things that don't appear, that are invisible. And what are the invisible causes of those things? And what's the concept of things following invisible rules of dependency?
In relation to that, and this might be impossible to answer, but in the task formulations also be influenced by this tool, I think. It can be that way around as well. Like a normal textbook question might be how many different are there, rather than can be constructed. These questions are so tightly connected to the kind of activities that the tools support. So a designer might almost write those questions without any thought about the difference between the question how many are there and how many can be constructed, because it's so much part of what geometry using this tool means. Because it would be the same answer in a sense, but not the same process of getting the answer.
Well, I mean, you can do these constructions on paper and pencil too.
Yeah.
And build in the dependencies using compasses and so on.
But you could also think of it as things like the more things that are there without being constructed, like not having the construction part of it, which is quite common in mathematics more generally.
I mean, if you were approaching these shapes around analytic geometry, then you could describe, it wouldn't be hidden anymore. And that's how, I mean, this is what was brought up yesterday, that's how GeoGebra works. That's what's with the black box underlying this has a complete description of
Right.
those dependencies.
Yep.
And so it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting epistemological feature of this, that you're using something that has to openly describe the entire situation in order to show a subset of that to the students in a fairly restricted way, so that they can recreate this 2,000-year-old process. I mean, I think it's more like an intellectually curious kind of, an intellectual kind of like funny thing. It's not particularly like pedagogically or didactically important. I mean, it's important that you're doing it. I just mean that epistemological relationship is more like an intellectual curiosity than anything that really needs to be brought into the PD. with
I
the
would say it's
teacher.
an intellectual accomplishment,
Yeah.
not a curiosity. No, I've hidden a lot from them. Like you say, it's all there in the black box of GeoGebra.
Yeah.
So, and then GeoGebra has this algebra view, which I brought up a couple minutes ago, which shows a lot of that
Yeah.
in the analytic geometry format. And I've hidden that. I haven't taught them how to look at the algebra view. I've hidden a lot of the tools from them. And I hid all of the circles that I used to create the dependencies in the different, and I did that intentionally. So the fact that the dependencies are invisible is an accomplishment of mine, having constructed them and then hidden the things that I didn't want them to see.
But then that means that the only way you can detect those dependencies is through the dynamic, through motion, which is interesting in one way, but also makes it difficult in another way. Because if they were to construct these with paper and pencil, they would have to explicitly engage with all the circles and the way those dependencies are constructed, whereas here they can only get at it through a tactile experience with the mouse. Or I guess it's not even a tactile, it's a semi-tactile experience of some kind. But I sort of wonder...
So what they do in paper and pencil, they could do pretty much the same thing. So to construct them with paper and pencil, you have to do the same thing as constructing them in dynamic geometry. Use the circles and so on.
Yeah.
So in paper and pencil, they can't drag them. What they do usually is measure them. They get out their ruler and they say, well, this figure here kind of looks like a rectangle, this one here. Let's measure this and see if it's the same length as this. And is this one the same length as this? And they get out their protractor and they say, is this a right angle? Is that a right angle? And in GeoGebra, you can have it display those things. So there's not that much difference between ancient Euclidean geometry and dynamic geometry at a certain level. Things really work very similarly.
But you could produce the same shape with different dependencies. Like topographically, you can
Yes.
create the same shape with different dependencies, and that's not actually visible here, unless you start moving them. So I think that's an interesting feature of the paper and pencil approach, where all of those dependencies are explicitly inscribed. Whereas here they're only they only become visible through motion, which is nothing that Euclid could have experienced. I mean, epistemologically, it's a completely different way of experiencing those shapes and those dependencies.
Yeah.
Right, it's interesting.
Re-engineered might be
Yeah.
the right word for what this tool does.
So we move on to the last excerpt here. So I guess this continues the discussion. So they're starting to re-engineer how